All right, so we'll turn to our last speaker for the day, who's David Rodin, who's one of the world's leading authorities on ethics and organizational culture. Widely credited as the founder of the revisionist just war theory, in 2011 he was named Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum, and in 2015 received the European Prize for Military Ethics. A senior fellow at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs in New York, David has advised some of the world's largest public and private organizations. Please welcome David to the stage.
Thank you. Amazing to be here. So, my name is David, and I'm a moral philosopher, and I spent a good part of my career working on issues around the ethics of war and working with different militaries around the world, helping them to articulate their policy and to solve difficult moral problems. So what moral philosophy is, what moral philosophers do, is try to unpack difficult moral problems and help us to solve them and reach resolutions to them in a better and more structured way. So I thought rather than talking about moral philosophy and what their process is, I thought that we could have a go at doing some here together, if you're up for it. Now, moral philosophy, philosophy in general, is really a kind of interactive, discursive, kind of struggling kind of thing, where I put ideas out there, I give you an explanation, and you say, no, that's rubbish, it's wrong because of this, and you give me yours, and I do the same for you, and together we reach a better position than either of us would have done. So ideally, we want to make this as interactive as possible. That's really hard to do in 17 minutes, but what I'd ask you to do is keep those critical, questioning, skeptical thoughts going in your mind, and if you want to, come in with a real quick micro interjection, and we'll see if we can do that as we go along. So when we think about ethics in the context of war and peace, what we want to understand are questions like, when is it permissible to use military force to go to war? Is it ever permissible to go to war? If there is a war situation, what are the restrictions and permissions that actors within that have? Who are you permitted to target? Is there a difference, for example, between a legitimate soldier and a terrorist? And those are the kinds of questions we want to ask. That's what we want to get to. Now, how do we go about answering that? Well, we need, first of all, some kind of theory of ethics. We need some kind of theory about what constitutes right and wrongful action. So here's an intuitive idea of how you might think about that. All right? So you might think, if anything matters morally, it's the generation of good outcomes for people. Right? What do we mean by good outcomes? Well, a good outcome is somebody surviving rather than dying. A good outcome is somebody experiencing pleasure rather than experiencing pain. A good outcome is individuals enjoying health and wholeness and bodily integrity rather than experiencing illness and injury, right? Those are all clearly different kinds of outcomes that matter morally. It matters that people experience good outcomes, experience welfare, pleasure, health, and so forth, rather than poor outcomes. And it seems to matter more or less universally, right? So my experiencing health and happiness and welfare is morally no more important than yours or anybody else's. We all are equal in that sense, right? That's another intuitive premise that we might bring to our thinking about ethics. So that leads us pretty naturally to the thought that if we're asking the question, what is the right thing to do? A pretty natural answer to that question is, well, the right thing to do is that action which creates the greatest amount of positive outcomes and the smallest number of negative outcomes, right? The thought here is, the right thing to do is to create the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. And indeed, this is one of the classical ethical moral theories. Any one of you who have done a university course in ethics will have come across this. The idea is often called utilitarianism or consequentialism, right? The idea that at any decision point, what you ought to do is to act in such a way as to generate the greatest superfluity of good outcomes compared to bad outcomes. Now, if you think about war in that way, what it's going to lead you to think is that any outcome or any action that produces better outcomes rather than worse outcomes is going to be permissible. So if you can target a certain group or a certain individual And doing that will help you to save a larger number of lives, and that's going to be the right and permissible thing to do. Now, that approach to ethics has a lot of virtues, and it has a lot of kind of intuitive plausibility. But I also want to suggest that there is something not quite right about it. Think about an example like this. So, when philosophers want to test a theory and an approach, we can't go out and do real-world experiments like physicists can do. But what we can do is thought experiments, right? So we can imagine situations and say, what would our theory tell us about that situation? And what do we think about what the theory is telling us? So here's a kind of philosopher's thought experiment. So you are a surgeon in a remote field hospital, and you have 5 critically ill patients in your field hospital. And each one of these patients needs an organ to be transplanted in order to survive. Without transplantable organs, these 5 patients are going to be dead in the morning. Unfortunately, you have no fresh organs and no possibility of getting them. You're in a very, very remote region. So these 5 patients you have are all going to be dead by the morning. But then you notice that there's a kind of local vagrant, a homeless guy, hanging around in the compound. And he doesn't really have any job or meaningful employment, doesn't really have any friends or family. No one would particularly miss him if he weren't there. And it strikes you, you could anesthetize this vagrant, remove 5 of his organs, and transplant them into your 5 patients, right? Now, what are you going to think about that if you're a utilitarian? Well, you got a decision point, 2 very different outcomes. One outcome, 5 people alive, 1 person dead. Other outcome, 1 person dead, 5 people alive, right? Looks like the answer is pretty easy. The right thing to do, it looks like, is to kill the person in the compound and save the 5 lives. That doesn't sound quite right, does it? Doesn't really feel like it's permissible to do that. In fact, it's actually, for consequentialism, the situation is even worse. Turns out it's not only that you're permitted to do that, right? You're morally obligated to do that, right? If you don't kill the 1 to save the 5, you're failing to do what would maximize best overall utility or the greatest general happiness. That looks like a problem. Right? That really looks like a problem if we have a moral view that says that it is permissible or even obligatory to go out and kill a perfectly innocent person in order to use their body parts to save 5 other people. So what's gone wrong here? Well, one of the things that seems to be missing from that account of what morality is, that focuses solely on outcomes and consequences, is the idea that human beings have a certain kind of moral status that requires us to treat them in a certain way. And this idea has been fleshed out in a number of different ways in the history of philosophy, but we know it most powerfully is associated with the idea of human rights, right? So one thing that we believe very profoundly about human beings is that we have certain basic rights, and amongst those is the right to life. Now, what we mean when we say that a person has a right is that we mean that we are required to treat them in a certain way, to give them a certain kind of respect, irrespective of the consequences that may or may not flow from that. Right? So to say that you have the right to life, or that you have the right to not to be tortured, or you have the right not to be sexually harassed or assaulted, means that you ought not to do those things, even if you could generate better overall consequences by doing them. Right? That's a very, very powerful fundamental idea within moral philosophy. It's a bigger question how you explain why we have those rights. But let's just start with the idea that we do have these basic moral status. Okay. So now we come back and we think about the case of war. Now it looks like we have another problem, right? If it's true that human beings have these rights, and these rights place limits on what we can do to people, even in order to produce good consequences, then how on earth can we explain that it's ever permissible to use military force? How can we explain that it's ever the right thing ever to intentionally kill another human being? Right? It looks like all military force is just going to be impermissible because it violates these rights. Now, that may well be the right answer, right? That may well be the right answer. And that takes us pretty directly to the position of pacifism. But there are at least reasons for thinking that there is a space for thinking about permissible, harmful action in war or military action. So let's think about another philosophical thought experiment. So you and I are walking down a dark alleyway in Oslo late at night, and a bandit jumps out at us and tries to attack you and stab you with a knife. And it's pretty clear that he's going to kill you unless I intervene. And the only way that I can intervene to save your life is by killing the assailant. And the question is, would I do wrong if I did that, if I killed the attacker in order to save your life? Now, most people think no. Most people think it would be permissible to do that. And they think, moreover, that in doing that, you wouldn't have violated the rights of the attacker. We think there's something about that situation that means that that attacker has in some way suspended or forfeited the rights that they had before. Right? When they were going about their business peacefully, they had the right not to be killed, the right to life, just like everybody else. But by undertaking a wrongful attack on you, they themselves have done something which means that that right to life is no longer present or fully operative in the way that it was before. And that's what makes it permissible for me to intervene, even to intervene with lethal force in order to save you. Okay? Does that sound right? It feels intuitive? Okay. So what that suggests is something very, very profound and important about rights. Now, one of the things that we're often taught about rights, if you've been to law school or studied history, we're taught a couple of things about human rights, especially basic human rights like the right to life. We're taught they are inalienable. They are possessed by us solely on the basis of our being humans. Essentially that they are things that we cannot lose. Now, when you think about cases like that self-defense case, we can see that's not quite true. These rights, even very basic rights, are not inalienable. They are entities or protections that we have that are really conditional upon our respecting the rights and status of other people. But they are protections that we can lose when we engage in wrongful ways. And it turns out that's actually an incredibly important part of the way that rights do provide the protections that they do to us. It's really important that rights are not only things that we possess, but they're things that we can also lose and surrender in particular kinds of ways. And rights protect us precisely because of the very particular ways in which we can possess them, but also in terms of the ways that we can lose them, as in the case of self-defense. Okay. So now we have a picture of kind of what rights are, how they protect us, but also, very critically, how we can lose them. So it looks like if we're going to give an account of morally permissible warfare, what we're going to have to do is give an account of how it can be the case that those against whom we are fighting can be viewed as having, as it were, properly forfeited their rights to life in the same way that the attacker had in the self-defense example. So it looks like what we're going to have to say is that military action is permissible insofar as those that we target have done something to make themselves liable to that use of force. And most paradigmatically, that's going to be because they have engaged in a wrongful attack on others. They've engaged in aggression or genocide or another crime that is so heinous that use of force against them might be permissible when that force is necessary and proportionate, and when they themselves have taken that step of engaging in very severe, wrongful, harmful action towards others. Okay? Does that make sense? That looks like this is going to have to be the kind of narrow passageway through which we're going to have to give this account of permissible killing in war, if we can do it at all. But now, here's a wrinkle. When you look back at the traditional thought on the ethics of war, and when you look at the laws of war as we have them now, it tells you a couple of different things. One of the things it tells you is that there are a class of actors who are always protected within war. That's the class of civilians, right? Non-combatants. And it tells you there's another class of actors, soldiers, enemy combatants, who are not protected. And what it tells you is that in a war, soldiers can target any enemy combatant on the other side. And it makes no distinction between whether those soldiers are fighting for the just side, right? Whether they're fighting in a defensive war against a state or an army that's engaged in a wrongful action like a genocide, or a soldier that is actually engaged in a wrongful action like aggression or genocide. It makes no distinction. It just says, as long as you're a soldier and you're targeting soldiers on the other side, what you're doing is permissible, right? It's not a wrongful act. That's what international law today tells you. Now, when you think about that in the context of this account that we've given, right, that says human beings have rights, they can lose those rights, but they can only lose those rights in these very specific cases where they have themselves done something wrong, like a wrongful attack. And that's the only way in which we can explain how you can lose the right. Then this view that you find in international law looks totally weird, right? Why on earth would it be the case that a soldier fighting defensively to protect the rights of others, let's say against a genocide, why on earth would they be seen as having surrendered their rights and being liable to attack? That just looks utterly, utterly weird. And so, now, that's a very debatable, controversial position. But what I wanted to do was to give an example of how taking a moral thought, a moral idea, and interrogating it, working with it, trying to understand what it tells us about different dimensions of a moral problem, can lead us very, very rapidly and quickly through a number of different positions that helps to illuminate the way that we think about right and wrong, the way that we think about ethics, and the kinds of decisions that we make within them. And rather than, wanting to persuade you about this or that particular conclusion in this case, more than anything else, what I want to leave you with is the sense that, we often think about ethics as being this kind of very intuitive gut feeling thing, right? This idea is, people often say, find your moral compass, find your true north, right? As if there's kind of something inside of you that will just point you in the right direction if only you get in touch with it. And what the philosopher in me wants to say is, yes, there is that, but there is also a very structured way that we can use and a set of tools that philosophers for thousands of years have been developing that helps us unpack and understand the nature of those decisions in very powerful ways and often can help us to clarify our own thinking and figure out where our thinking is muddy or problematic and often help us to get to better solutions as well. So let me stop there and look at my timekeeper to see if we have time to take a question or two.
All right, we have some time for some questions. Yep.
Yeah. So it's a great question. So in moral philosophy and in law, we draw a distinction between two kinds of ways that we can think about something that we would normally think as being wrongful and impermissible, but that we think about as being mitigated in some way. So one way that we think about that is this idea of something that is normally wrongful but is justified. And when we say that, we say the thing was normally the wrong thing to do, but in this situation, it was entirely appropriate and right. So the example that we gave of self-defense was like that, right? Normally it's wrong to kill someone, but in this situation where somebody is, wrong, about to kill somebody, about to murder someone wrongfully, and you step in and use force in a proportionate and necessary way and kill them, you haven't done anything wrong. You've acted in the right way. Now, there is a whole other series of considerations that also mitigate that sense someone has done something wrong, but in a very different way. And what you're describing is something that we would normally, what a lawyer or a philosopher would call an excuse. And the feature of an excuse is that we think that it makes us judge the culpability for the action less harshly, right? We say if somebody was under extreme pressure, or maybe they're under duress, right? So maybe somebody had kidnapped their children and was threatening to kill them unless they committed this crime. And we think, gosh, anybody in that situation would have acted in the same way. We don't want to blame them. We want to feel compassion towards them in a lot of ways. And so that mitigates the blame that we attribute to them. But critically, unlike in the situation of justification, we don't say that it makes the act right? We say something very interesting. We say the act that they did was wrong, right? When they attacked those innocent people and killed them, that was the wrong thing to do. But nonetheless, we understand why we did it, and therefore we view them in a less harsh way. And that has really significant consequences when you feed into that argument about rights, right? Because what the rights argument tells you is that you have you can surrender rights, you can forfeit rights when you engage in an action that is wrongful. And the person who acts wrongfully with an excuse is still acting wrongfully. And so we feed it in, but at the end of the day, we also say in real extremis, when there is no other option, then it can be the right thing to act. But it's a really important distinction and kind of element to bear in mind.
All right, we're actually out of time, but I really recommend coming up to David afterwards and posing your ethical dilemmas. And feel free to go to Emmy.
Ethical dilemmas solved, very cheap.
And feel free to go to Emmy and James as well if you have any questions or just comments or thank yous. I think this is it. This brings us to the end of Future Talks. Just before we go, could we have a huge round of applause for the organizers and the volunteers who've done such a lovely job?